Hello, and welcome to today's event. My name is Michel Hawks, and I'm the director of the Liu Institute for Asia and Asian Studies here at the University of Notre Dame. It is my great pleasure to act as moderator for this distinguished lecture for our research cluster on justice and Asia, the first in what we hope will become an annual tradition. The cluster on justice and Asia was established in 2018 with strong input from many of our Institute's faculty fellows who felt affinity with this theme and were eager to explore it across disciplinary boundaries. Each year, the cluster funds research projects in which faculty, graduate, and undergraduate students work together in engaging aspects of justice in relation to Asia. Our distinguished speaker tonight is Haiyan Li, Professor of East Asian Languages and Cultures and of Comparative Literature at Stanford University. Professor Li is a leading voice in the study of modern Chinese culture in relation to moral and ethical concerns. Her first monograph, entitled Revolution of the Heart, The Genealogy of Love in China, was published in 2007 and was the first ever study of literature to be awarded the prestigious Levinson Prize for books on modern China. Her second monograph, The Stranger and the Chinese Moral Imagination, published in 2014, examined how the figure of the stranger in Chinese fiction, film, television, and exhibition culture tests the moral limits of a society known for the primacy of consanguinity and familiarity. Tonight, Professor Li will be presenting work from her current and ongoing project, which centers on Chinese visions of justice at the intersection of narrative, law, and ethics. And the fascinating title of our talk today is A Murder in Manchuria. During the talk, please feel free to submit your questions at any time via the Q&A button. The event will conclude promptly at 5 p.m. Professor Li, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you for inviting me to speak at the Liu Institute and also for the very generous introduction. Well, it's after almost a year and a half of preparation. We started this discussion about a year and a half ago, I believe, during which a plane ticket was purchased, a hotel room was booked, an itinerary was drawn up, and even some pictures were taken. I am so glad to be able to sit right here in front of my computer to be speaking to all of you. It's a genuine pleasure after all of that. So I will just go right ahead and put my PowerPoint on the screen here. Right. Do you see the title slide? I assume you do. So I'm going to plunge ahead. Let me know if you're not seeing anything or if the slides are not changing. Okay. So as Michelle just mentioned, this talk, I better check on the chat here. Okay, very good. Thank you for confirming that for me. So this talk is drawn from my book manuscript on Chinese visions of justice. The book is a broad-ranging investigation of how the Chinese think about questions of law, morality, and justice by looking mostly at narrative fiction, including film, television drama, and novel. So today I am going to first walk you through a Chinese murder mystery. Unfortunately, there will be spoilers. I'm sorry about that. Can be avoided. But of course, we're here not just to be surprised, but also to figure out how a Chinese murder mystery both exploits and departs from genre expectations. And in the process, I hope to sketch out some of my thinking on Chinese justice. So let's begin with the murder case of Qiuying. Here are some colorful film posters, although the movie itself is actually black and white. The movie is based on a true crime case that unfortunately resulted in a series of wrongful convictions. And the real murderer, in fact, was never caught. I'm happy to tell you more about the real life case later. For now, let's stay with the film. So the location of the film, or the most of the plot, unfolds in China's northeast, what used to be called Manchuria, in the city of Harbin. The crime itself takes place on a river islet in the evening, and the film is set against the larger background of the Korean War. So the victim is a pretty young woman named Qiuying. She seems quite troubled in the beginning of the movie. So on the evening of her death, we see her in an argument with her fiancé. She seemed to be in an agitated state of mind. She tells him, let me see. The PowerPoint is cropped. I wonder if this is, I'm sorry about that, but I have no idea why the PowerPoint is cropped. Do you mean you cannot see the full PowerPoint? Can you see the picture of Qiuying? Yes, okay. Then I think we're okay. If you can see her picture, then I think you're seeing most of it, if not all of the screen. All right, so she tells her fiance that she must be somewhere she must go somewhere right away, and she can't tell him anything yet, but she will explain everything when she comes back. And of course, she doesn't. The detectives are two cops or two policemen working for the Municipal Public Security Bureau. And one is clearly higher ranked than the other, although both of them are very involved. Also, they only appear in their official role. There are no backstories about these two men, no glimpse into their private lives. So unlike many familiar Western detective heroes, they do not indulge in any private vices. The weapon is a gun. It's not found at the murder scene, but it surfaces later. And the prime suspect is the jealous and very hot-headed former boyfriend. There are many clues that seem to incriminate him, including a button from his jacket that is found at the murder scene, and also a recently fired gun found in his trunk with a bullet missing. And he also generally behaves in very suspicious manners, including trying to kill himself. But as any seasoned reader of whodunits knows very well, the most obvious suspect is usually the least likely one. And I imagine that older Chinese audience members may be quite familiar with this genre convention from their earlier exposure to detective fiction and crime movies of the 1930s. But we can debate that. So the suspense comes from shielding the identity of the murderer and also providing many tantalizing clues, some of which are, of course, red herrings. And then in the last third of the movie, a second and a third suspect are also identified. And now we get to follow these second and third suspect directly. And from here on, suspense works on a different register. We know who the bad guys are, but we don't know their motives and their objectives. The climax arrives when the main accomplice is dramatically exposed and arrested. And from her confession, we learn the identity of the real murderer. and the events leading up to the murder are then acted out in flashbacks. The murderer turns out to be a nationalist spy dispatched from Taiwan to prepare the ground for a nationalist recovery of the mainland during the Korean War. And of course, he gets his comeuppance when he is snapped right before he tries to board an ocean liner. And the film, although the film doesn't really show how he's punished, and of course we know this means that what happened to him or what befalls him is not important to the larger design of the film or the theme of the movie. The theme only really becomes apparent when we consider when the film diverges from a typical murder mystery. So now let's go right ahead and look at the divergence. So as I said, we don't get to meet the murderer until the last third of the movie, except for a very brief glimpse of his backside as he pulled the trigger. As a result, we haven't had a chance to suspect him as we would in a typical murder mystery. And also introducing the culprit out of the blue in a way, in the last minute or very late in the game, also breaches the contract of the detective genre. But then this breach is mitigated because we do get to meet the accomplice at the very outset. And here's the major spoiler. She turns out to be the victim's best girlfriend. And her revelation is truly surprising and shocking, which is perhaps why it's often her face that is featured in the movie posters as the face of the bad gal. Now, the divergence happens because of this genre shift from detection to counter-espionage. Because once again, the murderer is introduced to us very shortly before he's outed. We don't really care about him. But we're surprised by the revelation of Qiuying's best friend as the #1 accomplice, as well as the coordinator of the spy ring. And we still care about Qiuying. We want to know why she was murdered by a total stranger parachuted in from abroad. And for the answer to this question, we have to wait till the capture and confession of the accomplice. And only then do we realize that the most critical clue has been hiding in plain sight. This too, of course, is in keeping with genre conventions. So Qiuying's place of employment is the critical clue. As you remember, the movie is set in Harbin, which is at the forefront of the mobilization drive for the Korean War. And Qiuying works for the war logistics department of the municipal government. We learned that she was being coerced by the enemy to sabotage the war effort, and it's her wavering that sealed her fate. So her place of employment is the key missing link between a crime of passion and a political conspiracy. And the genre shift, I argue, serves to bring out this theme. All right, so let's take a closer look at the theme itself. I'm arguing here that the theme is closely connected to Maoist ideology, or the idea that no crime in the socialist state can be a simple crime of passion, and that the true enemy is necessarily exogenous. The true enemy necessarily comes from abroad. That is why the film does not end with a trial scene as is typical in a detective story, but the scene at the train station showing cheering crowds sending off Chinese troops to Korea, and also the ex-boyfriend and one of the detective officers on their way to new assignments on the war front. So I'm going to show you a very short clip that acts out the scene I just described. So here's the murderer being apprehended. I'm sorry, I couldn't find a version which sometimes the dialogue are not repeated.
在这次斗争中给了我很大的教训。你马上就要到朝鲜去了，我想别说了，事实给我的教训也不小啊。唉，真没有想到啊，我的政治嗅觉这么差。唉，在我来说啊，就更严重些。徐Qiuying是个走第三条道路的特务，邱地凡呢，是个披着人皮的狐狸。唉，所以说站稳立场，提高警惕，永远是我们的座右铭啊。嗯，对，很棒。哎，王亮同志啊，怎么要出发了？是啊，好，王亮同志啊，我谢谢你。不，这是我们的责任。哎，你也要走吗？怎么说呢？有个新的任务。好啊，让我们在不同的战场上都获得更大的胜利啊！好。
Okay, that's the very end of the movie. So justice in the end is served, but in a tiered fashion. So the murderer is arrested, and the round down to the victim is vindicated. So you see here the victim's mother is being comforted. But more importantly, the enemy's evil plans are foiled and the prosecution of the war is safeguarded. This is symbolized by the rapidly moving train carrying China's volunteer troops to Korea, as you have just seen. So the justice rendered to the victim and her family is what I'm calling low justice. And the justice delivered to China's war effort and by extension national defense is high justice. So now let me explain a little more these paired concepts that I'm using to frame this talk. So I borrowed this pair of concepts from Delia Lin, who is a scholar of ancient Chinese philosophy. She defines high justice or 正义 as pertaining to the legitimacy and moral supremacy of the ruler and by extension the state. And low justice or 公平 or 公正 as the fair treatment of people and the organization and the fair organization of society that can ensure such a treatment. In traditional China, political legitimacy rests on the mandate of heaven, which is fundamentally a moral principle. The law takes notice of human activity only when it threatens the emperor's or the state's interests. Unfair treatment of individuals can be tolerated if it serves to shore up the social order. This political logic explains the penal emphasis of imperial legal codes and the relative lack of civil legislation that many scholars of Chinese legal history have observed. That this emphasis on penalty stems from the assumption that any violent crime is an affront and a threat to the state's ability to maintain peace and order. Civil disputes, together with petty crimes, pertain to the problem of fairness and are relegated to the realm of customary law and left mostly to the discretion of village elders and local gentry. So in a word, high justice almost always trumps low justice. In the 20th century, modern ideologies of nationalism and communism have replaced the mandate of heaven to serve as the sacred sanction of governmental policies and actions. Still, in the name of serving high justice, a great deal of miscarriages of low justice can be tolerated, even justified. Justice still remains a vertical concept. In today's China, high justice is above all bound up with the question of official corruption, because corruption is a form of endemic moral failure that directly contradicts the party's claim on moral supremacy. When the party cracks down on corruption, it may find itself tackling no justice matters, but rarely for their own sake. More often than not, its harsh tactics bespeak high justice motivations. Due process is secondary to the overriding goal of social control and social harmony. That is why anti-corruption novels from contemporary China seldom dwell on questions of law or the judicial process. And legal professionals always play second fiddle to what Jeffrey Kinkley calls heroic CCP civilian generalists. CCP stands for Chinese Communist Party. Still, there is now growing space in China for law justice, and social justice movements have emerged to defend civil liberties and civil rights and demand for fair treatment for marginalized groups such as migrant workers, LGBT individuals, and even the disabled. In Mao's China, however, the space for law justice was basically nil. As we've seen in the movie, The Murder Case of Qiuying, all conflicts were immediately escalated up to the high justice plane, and this in Maoist lingo is called 上纲上线. And any ordinary crime was invariably revealed to be the tip of the iceberg of a vast conspiracy to overthrow the communist state and derail socialism. This is why detective fiction as a genre type, with its preoccupation with law justice, was basically banned under Mao, while the spy genre flourished. Now I want to say a little more about how the spy story and the detective story can be mapped onto the distinction I'm making here between high justice and low justice. And here I'm drawing mainly on the French sociologist Luc Boltanski. So he says that detective story chronicles crime in a society basically at peace, whereas the spy story offers us glimpses of war, but war under the cover of apparent peace. So he writes about detective fiction that posits a state perpetually at war against shadowy conspiratorial enemies, both internal and external. And the spy story also celebrates the state as a sovereign power that is defended by a core of technocrats and secret agents with iron discipline, Machiavellian intelligence, and self-abnegating patriotism. So in a spy story, there's, once again, no such thing as a random or a petty crime. All crimes are inherently political, targeting the body politic rather than individuals. In other words, a crime may appear to be a low justice matter, such as a crime of passion motivated by a love triangle, but it is always revealed to have high justice dimensions. So spies may hurt or kill ordinary citizens, but their objective is never simply life or property. Their goal is sabotage and subversion. This is made abundantly clear in the Qiuying case. The murderer has nothing personal against Qiuying. They, in fact, barely know each other. She is collateral damage in a larger struggle or a covert war. So in brief, spy stories are all about hidden pockets of conspiracy sustained by exogenous forces seeking to subvert the regime. Therefore, the need for constant vigilance and a paranoid state of mind, which is what one of the police officers is urging on the ex-boyfriend as they say goodbye to each other at the train station. So I hope I'm still doing okay with time. I think I'm okay. All right, so let me just elaborate a little more about how this distinction between high justice and low justice can be mapped onto this genre distinction, but now in a more cross-cultural context. So bringing the history of detective stories and spy stories from the West into consideration. So for the most part, let me see. So as you can see, I'm trying to once again drive home the point that what detective fiction is to low justice is what espionage fiction is to high justice. So for the most part, detective fiction operates in the low justice register and is fond of sinking its teeth deep into the entanglements of right and wrong among formally equal citizens in a state of law. High justice, on the other hand, is the province of espionage fiction, which dramatizes the high wire fight to defend the state against internal and external enemies. The detective genre in the West has a much longer pedigree, and it boasts a bigger cast of practitioners. Some of them are very well known and distinguished. And it also enjoys a much wider readership or audienceship than the spy thriller, which came on the scene about a century later and thrived primarily during the interwar decades and the ensuing Cold War period. So in the West, these two genres have remained more or less distinct. And this has to do with the liberal tradition that tries to ward off the state of war, the state at war from the state of law, and to prevent the pursuit of high justice from impinging on and undermining the pursuit of low justice. So today, we often talk about the rule of law. So here we can understand the rule of law as all about putting a fence around the state so that its imperatives, or what is usually known as reason of state, do not end up abrogating the rights and liberties of the citizens. So today, the spy genre in the West has taken a cynical turn, as evident in the novels of John le Carré. And this cynical turn really reflects the growing critique of empire and growing and equally strong mistrust of the state. But in China, the spy thriller is enjoying a kind of a renaissance by riding the coattails of an increasingly confident authoritarian state. So it makes perfect sense that the spy thriller should once again outshine detective fiction to become the new millennium's paean to statism. So now I'm coming to the concluding part of my talk. And I'd like to do this by showing you the larger design of the book. So my talk today is drawn from chapter 1, High Justice. And this chapter is attempt to flesh out this very important concept of high justice by reviewing sort of the history of spy thrillers in China. So the first part of the chapter is a fast-moving survey of spy thrillers from the Mao era. And in fact, I move very fast because there's so many. The only movie that I actually spent some time sort of fleshing out the plot and the implications is the movie that I told you about today, The Murder Case of Qiuying. And it's only because it's the exception that proves the rule, that you can, the sort of the generalities you can say about the rest of the Mao era spy thrillers. The second half, I home in on 3 contemporary spy thrillers that glorified government secrecy and counter-espionage operations featuring mainly code breakers. And then in the conclusion, I compare these post-Mao spy thrillers with the James Bond franchise, and I make some observations about how the divergence is grounded in the difference between the moral status of the state in an authoritarian state versus in an authoritarian society versus in a liberal state of law. And I think I will pause here. I'm happy to, if you're interested, I'm happy to tell you a little bit about real life case, but I want to make sure I'm staying on time. Let me see if I have any chat. If I am still okay with time, then I will tell you about the real life case. Okay, so the real life case, let me see, just make sure. All right, great. Oops, what happened? All right, so the real life case is usually known as the case of SHAO YUKUI, even though SHAO YUKUI is not the victim, but she's actually the prototype for the girlfriend who is revealed in the movie as the #1 accomplice. So the film is the real case actually happened in 1948. So a couple of years earlier than the setting of the film itself. And this is very significant. So bear that in mind. And the victim is named Zhao Jieshan. And as you can see, this is sort of an ID card that I found online. So she's the prototype of Qiuying. As you can see, that she works for this. This is interesting because Manchuria used to be under the influence of both Japan and Soviet Russia. So this identity card is bilingual in Chinese and Russian. And it says Zhao Jieshan works for the Cultural Guidance Committee, and she's just a clerk, right? It says nothing about her working for the War Logistics Department. That too is important. So she is murdered on a river island on an evening, and no murder, no culprit was caught. And then a few years later, her aggrieved father demanded a reinvestigation. So the police reopened the case, and this time we're now in the middle of the nationwide crackdown on counter-revolution. So the police homed in on Zhao's girlfriend, SHAO YUKUI, picture here, and they dug up the SHAO family's rather extensive, albeit low-level involvement with the former nationalist regime. But of course, during this period, any kind of ties with the former regime are enough to implicate you in an extensive investigation. So they rounded up SHAO YUKUI, her two brothers, and her brother-in-law. She, at the time, was very pregnant, almost near term. So under duress, she confessed to the murder of Zhao Jieshan and basically made up the whole story that became the basic plot of the movie. And the story was widely reported in the press, and the film adaptation was a national sensation. And as you can see, there was even a stage version produced and also a comic book version. But very soon after SHAO YUKUI was arrested and detained, she recanted. So a new investigation was ordered, and the investigative team discovered many discrepancies in her case. And they drew up a exculpatory report. But now we're right in the midst of the anti-rightist movement, and nobody really wanted to stick their neck out to speak for her. So the report was basically killed by the authorities for fear of political blowback. So SHAO YUKUI in this whole process lost her siblings to executions and also suicide. She herself was given the death sentence with a 2-year reprieve, which later was commuted to life sentence. And it was not until 1987, almost 30 years later, that her wrongful conviction was overturned and was released. So here's a picture of her becoming finally reunited with her family. While it is true that wrongful convictions were all, in fact, all too common in Mao's China, I think the SHAO siblings victimization was really a direct case of how high justice essentially hijacks low justice and ends up smothering low justice. And the film, as I mentioned it a moment ago, in order to foist this high justice frame on the case, it has to fast forward the case by 2 or 3 years, right, to 1950 or 51, so that it's set against the Korean War. It also assigns Zhao Jieshan, the victim, a new job, right? Instead of just a clerk in a cultural bureau, they make her work for the War Logistics Department. So once again, you can see that this is a case where in the film, high justice and low justice are both delivered in a kind of a seamless manner, whereas in real life, for the sake of high justice, low justice is rendered impossible, and we end up having a very serious case of wrongful convictions that resulted in a lot of human suffering, pain and suffering. So I'm going to pause here and be very happy to elaborate on any aspect of my talk that wasn't clear to you, and of course, very happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you so much. That was fascinating, and I'm really happy that you also told us the actual story of what actually happened beyond the story in the movie. Right? So, you know, I'd like to encourage the audience, and we have quite a few people in the audience today, both from Notre Dame and elsewhere, to write questions in the Q&A at the bottom of the page. And while you're doing that, I'd like to take the liberty to ask the first question, because I think this is a wonderful example of, you know, the kind of project that we're interested in our Justice and Asia cluster, right? Because you're obviously looking at, you know, across disciplines, you're looking at legal matters of literary and filmic genre, and the term justice itself is really central to what you're looking at. And at the risk of asking a really obvious question, I think the place to start might be your definition of justice, right? So I'm clear that you're saying that perhaps in Maoist China, and probably also still in today's China, high justice is more important than low justice compared to maybe countries like the US. But are we still talking about the same concept of justice, just a different balance between high and low, or should justice itself perhaps be defined differently when looking at China compared to looking at, say, the US?
Okay, thank you, Michelle, for that all-encompassing question. So yes, that is very much at the crux of my project, is to figure out is to work with the concept of justice that does justice to my Chinese materials. So I do spend a lot of time interrogating the different ramifications of different understandings of justice in the US and China. And you remember, at one point I mentioned that in China, justice has always been a vertical concept, because it's almost always bifurcated into high justice and low justice. So the question we might want to think a little harder about is whether the same bifurcation also exists in the US context. And I would say largely no. It's not that high justice, the idea of the legitimacy and moral supremacy of the state, doesn't exist in the US, but it's very much occluded by our overwhelming preoccupation with low justice and our rule of law being primarily devoted to defending the rights and liberties of the citizen, both against the state, but also against other entities. So it posits a kind of a kind of a horizontal horizon or horizontal domain where citizens are more or less equal, legally speaking and politically speaking. And justice is about ensuring the fair treatment of all these citizens who are equal, who have an equal claim to the protection of the law or and also the state. So that in that sense, I would say, you can say justice in the US is more or less a horizontal concept, whereas in China, it's also a horizontal concept, except there's also a vertical dimension that oftentimes impinges on the horizontal dimension and renders the horizontal pursuit of justice sometimes inoperative.
Great, thank you. Meanwhile, the questions are starting to come in. I'm not necessarily taking them in order, but I wanted to start with a question by my colleague, Susan Osterman, because I think it's linked to what you were just talking about. So Professor Osterman asks, or says, I would be interested to hear you speculate about what factors affect the emphasis on high justice versus low justice. Is the state the main actor here, or does society have a role to play?
Thank you. So factors, I would say the overriding factor is the fact that China is a one-party rule authoritarian state. So any pursuit of justice, understood in the sense of the pursuit of fairness or fair treatment, would have to contend with this fact that the rule of law sometimes is a very tenuous proposition in China. In fact, some scholars argue that the Chinese word for the rule of law, 法治, should be translated as rule by law. So the party stands in a very tricky relationship to law in general. And the party, in fact, regards itself as the ultimate guarantor of the rule of law. So it's both above the law and identical or coincidental with the law, and in some cases under the law, especially when it's cracking down on corruption. And certainly corrupt officials are indeed held accountable, oftentimes by the law books. So it's really hard to generalize. It's really hard to just characterize the Chinese legal imagination with only one set of features, because it all depends on where you're situated vis-a-vis the party or the authoritarian state.
Thank you. Question coming in from our research associate Sean King, zooming in from New York City, I believe. And Sean says, 1980s Cold War spy thrillers are currently very popular in North America and Europe. Do current mainland Chinese spy thrillers tend to be set in the modern day, or are they set in the past?
That is a great question. So the first part of your question about the sort of the renewed popularity of spy thrillers in sort of contemporary West is very intriguing. I think it warrants some serious investigation. I think it may have something to do with the new political moment we're in. We're seeing resurgence of white nationalism. We're seeing resurgence of populism, political sectarianism. So in a way, we're kind of perhaps reliving the Cold War in a different register. And as I said in my talk, spy thrillers are sort of the quintessential genre of the Cold War. So maybe that has something to do with the renewed popularity of this genre. In China, this is extremely interesting question. I spent a lot of time in the chapter trying to map out the time frame of all these different spy thrillers, because almost, to start with, almost none of them is set in the present. right? Because that would probably land the author in really hot water if you try to depict anything contemporary or current. So all of them are always set in the past, but how far back do you go is very, very interesting. So some of them, actually I'd say majority of them are set in pre-49 China, meaning pre-communist China, or what the Chinese like to say, pre-liberation China. So, and the primary enemies or primary rivals would be the communists and the nationalists, duking it out sort of in espionage fashion. So that's the I'd say that's the majority of the spy thriller setting, and then some of them are also set in post-1949 China as the new communist state tries to consolidate power and tries to root out any kind of subversive forces. Oftentimes, remnant nationalist spies seeking to, once again, to overthrow the new state, or spies dispatching from abroad, as we see in this movie, from Taiwan or from elsewhere, to try to rally the remnants and try to mount some sort of a counteroffensive, especially during the Korean War. That's I would say that's about the rest of the spy genres. Very few of them ever touch upon anything that's not about this kind of this defense of the state against hidden enemies. Occasionally you get a story about, as I mentioned, about code breakers trying to fight invisible enemies, right? Trying to fight enemies who are sending codes and sending signals. And there's also actually a very accomplished writer called Mai Jia, whose story that I actually look at very closely, who wrote a very popular, actually a bestseller about these code breakers.
Which was co-translated by one of my students, it so happens. But,
oh, that's right, yes.
So question, there's several questions coming in now. Question from Professor Anton Huang from our Film, Television and Theater Department. And he asks, aside from Gao Xingjian, have there been any other artistic film or theater narratives of unjust treatment arising from the Tiananmen Square cases?
Gao Xingjian, I believe it's actually Ma Jian, right? I think Ma Jian is the one who wrote Beijing Coma.
Yeah. Gao Xingjian has a play called The Fugitives, which refers to the Tiananmen cases.
I see. Thank you. Yes. So there's the movie Yuan. I believe it also alludes to 1989. There's also a novella by Hong called The Summer of Betrayal, also set against the events on Tiananmen Square. But I think that's about it. And all of them are of course forbidden in China. So yeah, that's one glaring case of injustice that will remain unaddressed probably for many years to come.
Thank you. Question from Professor Eunhua Zhang. Welcome to Notre Dame, Professor Zhang. She says, great talk, thank you. I wonder if you'd consider this issue, justice and genre, in a comparative or global context. How is this geopolitics played out in a similar genre in other countries, such as in spy movies during the Cold War and post-war in the US? And she mentions Rising Sun as an example.
Thank you. Hi, Eunhua. So I do some comparative analysis. As I mentioned, I compared these post-socialist spy thrillers to the James Bond franchise, but not much beyond that, because that would sort of take me too far off my main concerns. But I find some very interesting and telling divergences between how the Chinese envision their spy heroes and how James Bond and similar heroes are portrayed in Western films. One most perhaps I actually gave a talk last year where I started out by saying why Chinese spies don't fall in love or even sleep around, because that's one thing they never do. And yet some of the the television dramas and also novels are actually centrally structured around romance. And so it's all about how these spy heroes are irresistible attractions for the women around them, and yet they never fall for them. So that's that's pretty much sums up the entire romantic plot. Is that they have become in a way a kind of a high priest of the state. Right? They guard the state secret. They go around and scout out talents to go and work for the state, such as people with very special abilities to hear, to tell noise from signal and that sort of thing, or mathematical geniuses to go work for the state. And if then in the process, because the work is so stressful and so tension-filled that they often break. How we often think of geniuses as very brittle, right? They're basically half mad already. So usually they break during their work for the state, trying to break some enigmatic enemy code. And then the male hero will then take care of them and become their caretaker. And so so these heroes are essentially a kind of a class of priests who serve the state and who are basically married to the state. So they're not really available for anybody else. So anyhow, but it's a fascinating process to compare these the different treatment of romance and other kinds of emotional attachments in the two types of thrillers.
Great. I mean, following up from that, Saul Thomas is sort of maybe continuing this line of questioning, saying, are you perhaps making too strong a contrast between China and the West, raising Le Carré as the Western example, but he says, writers like Ian Fleming, Tom Clancy, certain TV shows are certainly much more patriotic and less cynical in their treatment of the theme. And he also mentions the America affirming patriotic film that was made out of Graham Greene's novel, The Quiet American, which the novel, of course, being a very cynical spy novel, but the movie becoming very patriotic. So are you perhaps expanding that contrast a bit too much?
I agree, mea culpa. Yes, sometimes when you're trying to make a point, you do tend to simplify a little bit. Yes, there are many patriotic American spy movies. And with very little of the kind of cynicism you see in John Le Carré and similar writers. Yeah, so movies in general tend to be more mainstream than novels. So even John Le Carré novels, I think, are darker than the movie versions. And same in China. So if you watch a television, even the titles that I surveyed, if I read the novel, I often feel that the novels can be quite edgy. And at times I would even be surprised that something made it through censorship. But the television adaptation will invariably water things down and become more politically correct. For example, in one of the stories where the woman actually, I believe the woman dies, but in the movie, in the TV adaptation, she can't die. She has to live because she can't possibly become a total sacrificial victim to the state's enterprises. So yes, you can find many patriotic Chinese American movies, but then even in these very sort of mainstream patriotic movies, the hero tends to have a maverick streak to them. And every now and then they will have to confront a moral dilemma where they may make very surprising choices, and they don't always choose country over woman or love. So I think occasionally they do surprise the reader and do something that you will never see in a Chinese movie.
Okay, we have a few minutes left. I'm gonna jump to a question that's just come in from Thomas Chan, who says, thank you for your thought-provoking presentation. How do you interpret recent films in which the legal and police apparatus is ineffectual in bringing about law justice, in films such as 亲爱的,爆裂无声 and 少年的你? The protagonists resort to extra legal means in their pursuit of law justice. Are they in fact taking exception to the absence of rule of law in China today? And I think there was another anonymous question earlier that also was asking about the extent to which perhaps nowadays in China, some of these stories could also have meanings that challenge the regime in some way.
Yes, hi Tom, that's very well put. So I would definitely go along with you in recognizing some of the newer television and film works that are very confrontational in some ways. Are not afraid to point out that justice is not possible within the formal legal systems. Therefore, it has to be found somewhere else in some extra legal domain or channels. In fact, the second chapter of my book on law justice, I decided against surveying detective stories or detective movies or movies centered on police or crime cases, because these stories, I think, in fact, the majority of them have already been studied by Jeffrey Kinkley in his study of the 法治文学 or legal system literature. So if you leave that body of literature aside, and the only thing you're really left are these very edgy film noir kind of stories about people taking the law into their own hands and try to seek justice in very risky manners. I decided that I would do something different, because I believe that in a society where the rule of law is very tenuous, and oftentimes the law is either absent or is sidelined, or sometimes the law itself is the very instrument of injustice. So the way to for people who are at the receiving end of power hierarchies, the way for them to seek justice is through what I'm calling subaltern hypocrisy, meaning small-time crookery, you know, lying, cheating, doing whatever you can on the slide to get what you need in life. So essentially, the subalterns are condemned to a kind of a double existence, right? You toe the official line, but then you do what you need to do. And one journalist even said, he says, just about everybody he knows in China is breaking the law in some way or another. And that's not surprising, right? Because to get what you need, you really have to circumvent the formal system. So I survey stories where basically people don't play fair. They cheat and they lie and they commit all manner of what legal scholars call mana prohibita, meaning regulatory crimes, right? Crimes against this rule, that rule, you know, all these cumbersome bureaucratic prohibitions against many things in China, and people just basically adopt this attitude. How it's said in Chinese? 上有对策, right? 上有政策, 下有对策, right? You know, policy above, we're going to have a coping mechanism down below. So what you get is a kind of a law justice that's achieved, but in a morally compromised manner, right? So law justice is possible in China, but oftentimes it has to be pursued either in an extra legal fashion, right? Where you can end up, in fact, yourself being a criminal, or you become a kind of a small-time crook, right? You do all these sort of quasi-illegal things to pursue low justice. So anyhow, I'm of course I'd be happy to on another occasion to give a talk on the second chapter on low justice. We're probably running out of time now.
Thank you so much. I'm going to remember the term subaltern hypocrisy. I think that's wonderful. So thank you to all the question askers. Those of you whose questions haven't been asked now during the live session, we will be forwarding all the questions to Professor Lee, so that you can continue the discussion where necessary and where appropriate. But for now, this is all we have time for. Professor Lee, thank you so much for being the first speaker in what I hope will be a very long series of distinguished lectures on justice and Asia at the University of Notre Dame. We are incredibly grateful for the insight you've given us into justice and into your own work. Audience, thank you for being here in such great numbers. And please join us again for our next major event, which is a panel discussion devoted to the histories of anti-Asian violence in the US. This will take place on Thursday, April 29th at 5:30 p.m. For details on how to register, as well as information about all our other events, please visit our website at asia.md.edu. Thank you and goodbye.